January 17, 1945. Luzon Island, Philippines. The air smelled of wet earth and iron. Rain had fallen through the night, turning the jungle floor into a slick carpet of rotting leaves and mud that clung to boots like memory itself. In a makeshift field hospital carved from the ruin of a schoolhouse, a young Japanese nurse named Kimiko Tanaka pressed herself against the splintered wooden wall, her hands trembling as she clutched a bundle of soiled bandages. Through the shattered window frame, she could see them approaching. American soldiers, rifles slung across their backs, carrying stretchers bearing the broken bodies of men who, only hours before, had tried to kill them. The rhythmic squelch of their boots in the mud synchronized with the pounding of her heart. She had been told that Americans were savages, that they took pleasure in cruelty, that mercy was a foreign concept to them. Yet here they came, faces grim but determined, lowering wounded Japanese soldiers onto makeshift cots with a gentleness that defied everything she had been taught to believe. She watched as a tall medic with mud caked fatigues knelt beside a Japanese private whose leg had been shattered by artillery fire. The soldier's face was gray with shock, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The American did not hesitate. He cut away the bloodied uniform, his movements practiced and efficient, speaking in low tones to his assistant, even as the wounded enemy soldier stared up at him with eyes filled with confusion and something that might have been terror. Kimiko noticed the American's hands, how steady they were, how careful. As he irrigated the wound with precious clean water, applied sulfa powder, and began wrapping the mangled limb with clean white bandages that seemed impossibly bright against the darkness of blood and mud. In that moment, something inside her began to fracture, a hairline crack in the foundation of certainty she had built her entire identity upon. This was not how war was supposed to work. This was not what the imperial propaganda broadcasts had promised. The Americans were supposed to be monsters, yet here was one of them treating her countrymen with the same care he might offer his own brother. The cognitive dissonance was almost physical, a nauseating vertigo that made the walls of the ruined schoolhouse seem to tilt and sway. She pressed her palm against the rough wood to steady herself, and as she did, she felt the world she had known beginning to dissolve like morning mist beneath the tropical sun. To understand the magnitude of what Kimiko witnessed that January morning, one must first understand the ideological chasm that separated the two sides of the Pacific War. The conflict between Imperial Japan and the United States was not merely a contest of armies and navies, but a collision of fundamentally incompatible worldviews, systems of belief so divergent that each side struggled to comprehend the basic humanity of the other. For Japan, the war was framed as a sacred mission, a divine crusade to liberate Asia from Western imperialism and establish a co-prosperity sphere under Japanese leadership. The emperor was not merely a political leader, but a living deity, and to serve him was to participate in something transcendent, something that elevated the individual beyond the mundane concerns of personal survival. Death in service to the emperor was not tragedy, but apotheosis, the ultimate fulfillment of one's purpose as a Japanese subject. This ideology was hammered into every citizen from childhood. In schools, children learned that Japan was a unique nation, blessed by the gods, superior in spirit to the materialistic West. They were taught that Americans were soft, decadent people who valued comfort over honor, who would flee at the first sign of true hardship. The Western democracies were portrayed as spiritually hollow, their individualism a kind of moral sickness that weakened the social fabric. Japanese soldiers were indoctrinated to believe that surrender was the ultimate disgrace, that to be captured alive was to forfeit one's humanity and bring eternal shame upon one's family and ancestors. The Senjin-kun, the military code issued in January 1941, explicitly stated, "Do not live in shame as a prisoner. Die, and leave no ignominious crime behind you." This was not metaphor or exaggeration. it was literal doctrine, enforced through a combination of social pressure, military discipline, and genuine religious conviction. Consequently, the treatment of prisoners of war became a point where this ideological framework manifested in its most brutal form. If Japanese soldiers believed that their own capture would be an unforgivable dishonor, they extended this logic to enemy prisoners, viewing them as men who had voluntarily discarded their humanity by choosing captivity over death. The horrific treatment of Allied prisoners, the forced marches, the starvation, the casual brutality, was not merely sadism, but the logical outcome of a worldview that saw surrender as moral abdication. The Bataan Death March, which had occurred just 3 years earlier in April 1942, had seen approximately 75,000 Filipino and American prisoners forced to march 65 miles in tropical heat without adequate food, water, or medical care. Between 5,000 and 11,000 died along the route, beaten, bayoneted, or simply left to expire by the roadside. Those who survived were imprisoned in camps where malnutrition, disease, and systematic abuse claimed thousands more. Against this backdrop, the behavior of American medical personnel toward wounded Japanese soldiers represented not just a tactical choice, but a philosophical statement about the nature of civilization itself. The United States had signed the Geneva Convention of 1929, which established rules for the humane treatment of prisoners of war and mandated that wounded enemy combatants receive medical care without discrimination. But adherence to this treaty was not universal even among signatory nations, and in the brutal island campaigns of the Pacific, where fighting often degenerated into savage close-quarters combat and atrocities were committed by both sides, it would have been entirely understandable if American forces had allowed legal niceties to erode in the face of practical exigency and emotional retaliation. Yet, the American military medical establishment insisted, with remarkable consistency, on upholding the principle that enemy wounded deserved treatment. This was partly pragmatic. Well-treated prisoners provided valuable intelligence, and demonstrating mercy could encourage surrender, thereby saving American lives. But it was also ideological, rooted in a democratic philosophy that insisted on the inherent dignity of the individual, regardless of nationality or circumstance. The U.S. Army Medical Department's mission statement was explicit. All sick and wounded would be treated without regard to military or civilian status, race, nationality, or religion. This principle was not always perfectly implemented. There were instances of abuse and neglect, but it represented the official policy and was enforced through the chain of command with a rigor that would have been incomprehensible to the Imperial Japanese military. American medical personnel were trained to view wounded enemy soldiers not as despised adversaries but as patients. This clinical reframing allowed for a kind of professional detachment that made compassionate treatment possible even in emotionally charged circumstances. A medic treating a wounded Japanese soldier was not required to forgive or forget what that soldier might have done to his comrades. He was simply required to do his job, to apply his training, to maintain the standards of his profession. This seemingly modest distinction had profound implications, creating a space where humanity could persist even amid the dehumanizing machinery of total war. Kimiko Tanaka had not always been a nurse in a field hospital. She had grown up in Hiroshima, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a shopkeeper's wife, in a household where education was valued and where she had been encouraged to pursue a profession. Nursing had seemed a natural choice, a way to serve her country while also exercising skills and knowledge that gave her a sense of purpose and competence. When the war began in December 1941, she had been 20 years old, newly graduated from nursing school, filled with the same patriotic fervor that swept through Japan in those early days of seemingly endless victory. She had volunteered for service with the Imperial Army Medical Corps, expecting to tend to wounded heroes, to be part of the great national mission that would reshape Asia and prove Japan's spiritual superiority to the world. The reality had been rather different. By early 1945, the tide of war had turned irreversibly against Japan. The string of crushing defeats, Midway, Guadalcanal, Saipan, Leyte Gulf, had hollowed out the Imperial Navy and left Japan's island empire in tatters. American forces were advancing inexorably toward the home islands, and the defense of the Philippines had become a desperate, doomed rearguard action. The field hospital where Kimiko served was barely worthy of the name. A collection of damaged buildings, inadequate supplies, and overwhelmed staff trying to care for a flood of casualties that far exceeded their capacity. Medicine was scarce. Anesthesia was almost non-existent. Amputations were performed with whatever tools were at hand, often without even sake to dull the pain. Men died not from their wounds but from infection, from gangrene, from simple lack of bandages and antiseptic. She had watched soldiers die who might have been saved with proper treatment. She had held the hands of boys barely older than her younger brother as they slipped away, their bodies consumed by fever, their final words often a confused cry for their mothers. She had learned to steel herself against grief, to become hard and efficient because any other response would have been intolerable. And she had absorbed the propaganda that explained these horrors, that framed them as noble sacrifice in service to the emperor and the nation. When soldiers told her they hoped to take at least one American with them before they died, she nodded and assured them their deaths would not be in vain. When officers spoke of the coming final battle on the home islands, where every Japanese civilian would fight to the death rather than submit to American occupation, she believed them and accepted her own likely death as an unfortunate but necessary part of Japan's destiny. She expected Americans to be ruthless. The propaganda had been clear on this point. They were barbarians, motivated by greed and racial hatred, who would show no mercy to captured Japanese personnel. She had been told that American soldiers committed atrocities as a matter of course, that they took trophies from the bodies of the dead, that they raped and murdered civilians without compunction. Some of this was true. There were documented instances of American war crimes in the Pacific, moments when the rage and dehumanization of combat overwhelmed discipline and decency. But the propaganda had taken these incidents and universalized them, creating a portrait of the enemy that was more caricature than reality, designed to harden resolve and justify the total mobilization of Japanese society for a war that could no longer be won. So when the American forces overran the hospital's position on that rainy January morning, Kimiko had expected the worst. She had heard the explosions growing closer throughout the night, the rattle of small arms fire, the shouted commands in a language she could not understand. The Japanese soldiers who had been guarding the hospital had melted away into the jungle, following orders to regroup and continue resistance, leaving the medical staff and wounded behind. She had hidden in a storage room with 2 other nurses, certain that when the Americans found them, their lives would end in violence and degradation. They had clutched each other in the darkness, praying silently, waiting for the inevitable. Instead, an American sergeant had opened the door, taken one look at the 3 terrified women huddled among sacks of rice and boxes of medical supplies, and lowered his weapon. He had called over his shoulder in English, then made a calming gesture with his hands, palm down, moving them slowly up and down, an unmistakable signal to stay calm, that they were safe. Another soldier had appeared, one with a Red Cross armband, and he had smiled, actually smiled, and said something in a gentle tone that she could not understand, but that somehow conveyed reassurance. They had been escorted outside, not roughly, but with a kind of impersonal efficiency, and told through gestures to sit against the wall of the schoolhouse. And then the Americans had begun carrying in the wounded, both their own casualties and the Japanese soldiers who had been too injured to flee. It was then that Kimiko had seen something that shattered the carefully constructed narrative she had lived within for 4 years. The American medic's name was Thomas Sullivan, though Kimiko would not learn this until much later. He was 24 years old, from a small town in Iowa where his father ran a hardware store and his mother taught piano lessons. He had been drafted in 1942, trained as a combat medic, and shipped to the Pacific in the spring of 1943. By January 1945, he had seen more death and suffering than most people would witness in several lifetimes. He had treated shrapnel wounds on Tarawa's blood-soaked beaches, held dying men on Saipan, waded through the jungle on Peleliu, pulling wounded Marines from the path of Japanese counterattacks. He had developed the medic's necessary callousness, the ability to function under fire, to triage rapidly and dispassionately, to accept that some men could be saved and others could not. But he had also developed something else, a fierce pride in his profession and in the principles it represented. He had seen what happened when medical care broke down, when men died not heroically in combat, but miserably from preventable infections, from shock that could have been treated, from wounds that closed hospitals with proper equipment would have handled routinely. He had come to view medicine as a kind of bulwark against chaos, a set of practices and principles that maintained human dignity even amid the degrading horror of war. Treating wounded enemy soldiers was, for him, not a moral quandary, but a professional obligation, as natural as breathing. The Geneva Convention was part of it. Certainly, he had been trained in the rules, knew the regulations. But his motivation went deeper than legal compliance. He treated Japanese wounded because he was a medic, and that was what medics did. The alternative, allowing wounded enemy soldiers to suffer and die when he had the means to help them, would have been a betrayal of everything his profession stood for. It would have meant letting the war turn him into something other than what he was, allowing the dehumanization to win. And Tom Sullivan was not willing to let that happen, so he worked on the shattered leg of a Japanese private with the same focused intensity he brought to treating American casualties. He noted the signs of shock, the rapid pulse, the cold, clammy skin, the confusion, and elevated the legs, covered the man with a blanket, started an IV of plasma to restore blood volume. He administered morphine to ease the pain, carefully marking the dosage on the soldier's forehead with a marker so that subsequent medical personnel would know what had already been given. He splinted the fractured limb with wooden boards and strips of cloth torn from medical supplies, immobilizing it to prevent further damage. He cleaned and dressed the wound with sulfa powder and sterile bandages, doing everything in his power to prevent infection. And then he moved on to the next patient, a Filipino civilian with abdominal wounds, and began the process again. Kimiko watched all of this from her position against the wall. She watched the American medics work through the morning, treating casualties in order of medical priority without regard to which uniform they wore. She saw American soldiers with sucking chest wounds receive immediate attention, while less severely wounded Japanese were made to wait. Not out of favoritism, but because that was how triage worked, how you maximize the number of lives saved with limited resources. She saw a Japanese officer with a head injury placed on a stretcher beside an American corporal with a mangled hand, both men receiving careful examination and treatment from the same doctor. A weary-looking captain with salt-and-pepper hair who moved from patient to patient with a quiet competence that suggested decades of practice compressed into a few years of war. She saw, most strikingly, the medical supplies. The Americans seemed to have an inexhaustible abundance of everything the Japanese hospital had lacked. Clean bandages by the crate, bottles of plasma and whole blood for transfusions, morphine syrettes by the dozen, sulfa drugs and penicillin, the wonder antibiotic that could stop infections that would otherwise mean death or amputation, surgical instruments that gleamed even in the dim light filtering through damaged walls, cans of food, boxes of cigarettes, even coffee brewing over a portable stove. The sheer material wealth on display was staggering, incomprehensible to someone who had spent years coping with shortages, who had watched men die for lack of a few cubic centimeters of morphine or a handful of sulfa powder. This abundance was not accidental. It was the product of American industrial might, the output of factories that had converted from producing automobiles and refrigerators to producing the materiel of war, and had done so with an efficiency and scale that the Axis powers simply could not match. By 1945, the United States was manufacturing more military equipment than all other combatant nations combined. American shipyards were launching an aircraft carrier every month, a destroyer every 5 days, a Liberty ship, a 10,000-ton cargo vessel, every 48 hours. American factories were producing a bomber every 63 minutes, a tank every 6 minutes, and the supply chain extended all the way to frontline medical units, ensuring that American forces had the resources they needed to treat casualties effectively. Japanese soldiers and nurses who encountered this system for the first time often struggled to comprehend it. Their own military operated on the principle of spiritual strength compensating for material weakness, the idea that superior morale and willingness to sacrifice could overcome technological and industrial disadvantages. But there was a limit to what willpower could achieve, and by 1945, that limit had been reached and surpassed. Japanese forces were starving, literally in many cases, surviving on handfuls of rice and whatever they could forage. They were fighting with weapons that were increasingly obsolete, aircraft that were outclassed, ships that could not be replaced, and they were dying of wounds that could have been treated, succumbing to infections that could have been cured, because their supply system had collapsed under the weight of American submarine warfare and strategic bombing. For Kimiko, seeing the difference was a revelation that went beyond mere material envy. It forced a question that she had never before allowed herself to consider. If America had such resources, such abundance, such evident wealth and power, how could the propaganda's portrait of them as a decadent, failing civilization be accurate? How could a nation on the brink of collapse, as Japanese propaganda insisted, produce this endless flow of supplies? How could a people who were supposedly spiritually inferior, morally weak, individualistic to the point of social dissolution, organize themselves with such evident efficiency and effectiveness? The cognitive dissonance was painful, physically painful, a pressure building behind her eyes. She had been raised to believe that Japan's spiritual strength was its great advantage, that Americans were strong in body but weak in soul, that their materialism was a kind of sickness that would ultimately lead to their defeat. But what she was witnessing suggested something different, that perhaps material abundance and moral principle were not mutually exclusive, that democracy and efficiency could coexist, that the Americans' professed values might actually mean something. Over the following days, as the hospital was integrated into the American medical evacuation system, Kimiko had the opportunity to observe more closely. She and the other Japanese nurses were not imprisoned in any conventional sense. They were required to remain within certain boundaries, and armed guards were posted. But they were not mistreated. They were given food, more and better food than they had seen in months. K-rations, those ubiquitous canned meals that American soldiers complained about endlessly, seemed like feast to someone who had been subsisting on watery rice gruel and occasional fish. She tasted her first chocolate bar, the sweet richness of it almost overwhelming. She drank coffee with powdered milk and sugar. Luxuries she had nearly forgotten existed. But more significant than the food was the attitude of the American personnel. They were not cruel. They were not gleeful in victory. They seemed, if anything, tired, profoundly, bone-deep weary in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion and everything to do with having seen too much death, too much suffering, too much evidence of humanity's capacity for destroying itself. They did their jobs with a kind of grim professionalism. And when they had free time, they wrote letters home, played cards, listened to music on portable radios, and tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy in circumstances that were anything but normal. She watched them interact with the wounded Japanese soldiers, and she saw something she had not expected to see. Not cruelty, not even coldness, but a kind of impersonal compassion. They were not friends, certainly. There was no camaraderie across the battle lines. But there was recognition of shared humanity. An American medic would check a Japanese patient's bandages with the same care he showed to American wounded. A doctor would examine a Japanese officer's infected wound with the same focused attention he gave to his own countrymen. When a young Japanese soldier died despite their efforts, she saw an American nurse pause, place a hand briefly on the dead man's chest, in what might have been a gesture of respect or sorrow, before moving on to the next patient. These were small moments, easily missed, but they accumulated into something larger, a pattern that suggested these Americans genuinely believed that even enemy soldiers deserved basic decency. One incident stood out with particular clarity. A Japanese lieutenant, badly burned in an air attack, had regained consciousness and become agitated, struggling against his restraints and shouting in Japanese. He was demanding to be allowed to die, insisting that he was dishonored by his capture, that his family would be shamed. His distress was causing his heart rate to spike, threatening to destabilize his already fragile condition. The American doctor, not understanding the words but recognizing the medical emergency, had called for one of the Japanese nurses to translate. Kimiko had been the one to respond. Through her halting translation, the doctor learned what was causing the lieutenant's distress, and his response had surprised her. He had not dismissed the man's concerns as irrational, or told him to be grateful for his life. Instead, he had spoken seriously, making eye contact, treating the lieutenant's anguish as legitimate, even if he did not share the cultural framework that produced it. He had explained, through Kimiko's translation, that the lieutenant was a prisoner of war, that he would be treated in accordance with international law, that he would be cared for until he recovered and then would be transferred to a POW camp, where he would remain for the duration of the war. He had assured the lieutenant that his family would be notified through the Red Cross that he was alive, that there was no dishonor in having been unconscious and unable to resist when captured, he had said. And Kimiko remembered the words precisely because they had seemed so strange coming from an enemy officer. "Your war is over, Lieutenant. You fought bravely. Now, you need to let us help you heal." The Japanese officer had stared at the American doctor for a long moment, and then, to Kimiko's astonishment, he had begun to weep. Not loudly or dramatically, but with silent tears streaming down his burned face. The doctor had placed a hand briefly on the man's shoulder, nodded to Kimiko, and moved on to the next patient. And Kimiko had stood there, shaken, realizing that she had just witnessed something that should not have been possible. According to everything she had been taught about the enemy and about the nature of this war, the symbolic object that haunted Kimiko's mind fee. Memory in the years that followed was neither weapon nor flag, nor any of the conventional markers of war, but something far more mundane, the white bandage. Clean, sterile, abundant. The American bandages represented a fundamental difference in approach to human life and suffering. In the Japanese military medical system, bandages were precious, reused when possible, often improvised from whatever cloth was available. She had seen men with wounds dressed in strips torn from uniforms, from civilian clothing taken from villages, even from the clothing of the dead. Cleanliness was a luxury, sterility and aspiration often unmet. Infection was common, gangrene a constant threat. Men died because their wounds became contaminated, because the basic supplies for proper wound care simply did not exist in sufficient quantity. But the Americans had white bandages, crates of them, clean and neatly packaged, used once and discarded. This wastefulness, for that was how it appeared to Japanese eyes, was actually a cornerstone of effective medicine, a recognition that preventing infection was far more effective than trying to treat it, that the cost of supplies was negligible compared to the cost of human suffering and lost manpower. The white bandage became, in Kimiko's mind, a symbol of something larger, the idea that human life had intrinsic value, that it was worth expending resources to preserve, that individuals mattered not just as instruments of state policy, but as ends in themselves. This was a profoundly democratic notion, though Kimiko did not have the vocabulary to articulate it in those terms at the time. In the Japanese imperial system, individuals derived their worth from their relationship to the state and the emperor. The collective was paramount, and personal desires, comfort, even survival were properly subordinated to the needs of the nation. This was not merely propaganda, but deeply embedded cultural values. The legacy of Confucian hierarchies, samurai ethics, and the specific historical circumstances of Japan's rapid modernization. To serve the state was to fulfill one's purpose. To preserve one's individual life at the expense of that service was to become worthless, even contemptible. American democracy rested on different foundations. The Enlightenment idea that individuals possessed inherent rights, that governments existed to serve citizens rather than the reverse, that each person's life had value independent of their utility to the state. This was imperfectly realized in practice, certainly. American history was marred by slavery, segregation, the displacement of indigenous peoples, failures to live up to professed ideals. But the ideals themselves had power, created expectations and aspirations, established a framework within which injustices could be challenged and gradually, painfully addressed. And in the specific context of military medicine, these principles manifested in the conviction that wounded soldiers, even enemy wounded, deserved treatment, that suffering should be alleviated when possible, that human dignity should be preserved even in the degrading circumstances of war. Kimiko did not convert to American ideology overnight. The transformation was gradual, painful, marked by resistance and backsliding. She would find herself thinking in the old patterns. The Americans are weak, they waste resources, their sentimentality will be their downfall, only to remember a specific moment, a specific act of care that contradicted the propaganda. She would feel loyalty to Japan, to the emperor, surge up inside her, only to confront the question, if the emperor truly cared about his subjects, why had he allowed the war to continue long after victory became impossible? Grinding up millions of lives in a futile attempt to stave off the inevitable? She would recall the noble rhetoric about sacrifice and glory, and then remember the reality. The screaming men with shattered bodies, the teenagers dying of preventable infections, the utter waste of it all. The other Japanese nurses experienced similar crises of faith. They would gather in the evenings, speaking in low voices, sharing observations and doubts that would have been dangerous to voice in other circumstances. One nurse mentioned that she had seen an American soldier give his own ration chocolate to a wounded Japanese teenager. Another spoke of a doctor who had worked through the night to save a Japanese officer's life, performing a delicate surgery that he could have avoided simply by classifying the case as hopeless. They compared notes on the abundance of American supplies, the efficiency of their logistics, the obvious health and morale of their troops, and gradually a consensus formed, unspoken but understood, that they had been lied to, that the war was not what they had been told it was, that perhaps defeat was not the apocalypse they had been taught to fear. The transformation of perception was not limited to Kimiko and her colleagues. Across the Pacific, in POW camps and field hospitals, on Okinawa and the Philippines and dozens of smaller islands, Japanese soldiers and civilians encountered Americans and struggled to reconcile their experiences with the propaganda they had internalized. The testimony is remarkably consistent. Prisoners of war, expecting torture and execution, instead found themselves in camps where they received adequate food, medical care, and even recreational opportunities. They were shocked by the quantities of supplies available to American forces, the clothing, the equipment, the casual abundance that seemed to characterize everything the Americans did. They were surprised by the relative lack of formal hierarchy, the way enlisted men would speak casually to officers, the absence of the ritual beatings and harsh discipline that characterized the Japanese military. One Japanese sergeant, captured on Saipan in July 1944, later recalled his astonishment at being given a full medical examination upon arrival at a POW camp, including dental work to repair teeth damaged by malnutrition. He had entered American captivity expecting to be worked to death. Instead, he found himself gaining weight for the first time in 2 years, receiving treatment for chronic dysentery, sleeping on a cot with a mattress. His testimony, recorded by American intelligence officers seeking to understand Japanese psychology, reveals the cognitive struggle. "I could not understand why they treated us this way. We had been told Americans tortured prisoners, but they gave us more food than we had eaten as soldiers of the Emperor. I became confused about what was true. This confusion was itself a kind of warfare, not psychological operations in any coordinated sense, but the simple impact of one system of values confronting another. American forces did not generally engage in systematic propaganda directed at Japanese prisoners. They did not need to. The material reality spoke for itself. A Japanese soldier who had been told that America was on the verge of collapse, that the American people were war-weary and ready to surrender, could see with his own eyes the endless flow of equipment and supplies that suggested otherwise. A nurse who had been taught that American individualism produced social weakness could observe the efficient coordination of military medicine and wonder if perhaps collectivism and efficiency were not synonymous. A prisoner who had been assured that Americans were racial inferiors could interact with guards and medical personnel of various ethnicities, white, black, Hispanic, Asian American, and begin to question the entire edifice of racial ideology that underlay Japanese imperialism. The white bandage, in this context, became more than a medical supply. It became evidence of a different way of organizing society, a marker of priorities that valued human life and dignity in ways that the Japanese military system did not. When Kimiko changed dressings under American supervision, using clean bandages pulled fresh from their packages, she was participating in a ritual that embodied democratic principles. The idea that even enemy wounded deserved care, that suffering should be minimized, that individuals mattered. Each bandage was a small refutation of the ideology she had served, a quiet argument for a different set of values. By February 1945, the hospital had been fully evacuated. The wounded Americans sent to rear area facilities in Australia or Hawaii.